The Department of Foreign Affairs said the Philippines has filed another diplomatic protest against China, the 55th just for 2023 alone. The protest comes after one of the Philippines' contracted boats on a resupply mission to the Ayungin Shoal was blocked by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, resulting in a collision. During that same mission, a Philippine Coast Guard vessel's port side was also, according to reports, bumped by Chinese Maritime Militia vessel while it was lying to approximately 6.4 nautical miles northeast of Ayungin Shoal. The Chinese Coast Guard, meanwhile, promptly released a statement on Sunday saying the Philippine vessels made an unauthorized entry, deliberately stirred up trouble by reversing and colliding with a Chinese fishing vessel, which was just floating in the vicinity, according to its statement. We'll talk about this latest incident in the West Philippine Sea and its larger implication in the geopolitical scene in Southeast Asia with a maritime expert. Welcome, everyone. Come inside and join us inside the press room. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us inside the press room where we delve deep into the pressing issues of our country today. I am Rama Lopez, the associate editor of Press1.ph, and joining me inside the press room is our editor at large and columnist, our Pulitzer Prize winner, Manny Mogato. Hello, Mogs.
Hello, Romel, and it's different this time because we're speaking in foreign language because our guest is a foreigner.
Yeah, our guests might be, our regular viewers might be surprised. Let's talk a little Tagalog here. Wag ko kayo matakot. We did not relocate to another country. The press room is still in the Philippines. This is just a special issue because our guest for today is a maritime expert based in the United States. So Mogs, talagang mas malalim na pag-uusap natin ito because our guest has the actual data and actual satellite images and I think years of experience also of monitoring the aggressive maneuverings or aggressive tactics of China in the South China Sea.
Yes, that's correct. And hopefully, uh, our listeners and viewers can learn more about from his expertise. No?
Yeah. And for our guests, because we're not live this time, but this is tape, you can still join the conversation. We'll read some of your comments later on in another episode of the show because, as we all know, I don't think this issue would go anytime soon as China's aggression continues in. We expect it will heighten in the coming days. So let's now call into and invite inside the press room our guest speaker. He's a former U.S. Air Force colonel, the director of SeaLight and Project Lead for Project Myoushu at Stanford University's Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. Please welcome inside the press room maritime security expert Ray Powell. Hello, Ray. Welcome.
Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing
Yeah.
great.
Good evening, Ray, in the U.S.
Indeed, it is. And I do apologize that you're forced to speak English with me. My Filipina asawa has tried for 33 years to teach me another language, and it just doesn't take. It just doesn't work on me. I don't know what it is.
It's okay, Ray. Actually, I think our audiences will be the ones who will be surprised that hey, Rommel and Manny are speaking in straight English because they're used to our podcast, listening to our podcast, and watching us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, always in
In Tagalog.
conversational
Yeah.
Tagalog. So let's also keep it that way. But in a way, we don't water down the issue because I know that this issue is really very important, not only for the Philippines, but as we can see also for the United States, because it delves on the issue on freedom of navigation in that area. But before we delve into what China has been doing the past months, Ray, can you tell our audience a brief background of your work at the Gordian Knot Center?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I spent 35 years in the military. I was, in fact, my very first overseas assignment was to Clark Air Base, Republic of the
Oh,
Philippines. My new wife and I left in 1991, in June of 1991. And
mm-hmm.
for, if you remember correctly, that was when Mount Pinatubo exploded. And
Yeah.
we left by ship because that was the only way they could get everybody out. So I have been associated with the South China Sea for a very long time. I was originally actually, so I actually do speak another language. It's Vietnamese, though, unfortunately, not Tagalog, um, because that was my first job, was as a Vietnamese linguist. And so after I left the Air Force, so my last couple of assignments were a diplomatic role. So I was in Hanoi as the air attaché, and then in Australia as the defense attaché for the United States. And when I got out, I came back here to California and I took a fellowship at Stanford. And while I
Mm-hmm.
was here, I began to look into the question that had bothered me for a long time, which is that I really didn't understand our strategy for countering China's moves in the South China Sea. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, I'd been in roles where I was supposed to know what it
Yeah.
was that we planned to do about all this, and I really couldn't enunciate it very well. And so I entered into a project with the Gordian Knot Center to try to come up with a different approach. And the Gordian Knot Center uses a method used by entrepreneurs, like in business, to discover customers, to discover new markets and that kind of thing. But we used it to discover more effective policies. And so we
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of conversations. I went out to the Philippines in March of last year to have March of last year to have, excuse me, I'm getting my months mixed up. The summer of last year to have a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
initial conversations, and then out again in March, and then again this past summer. And all of that, a lot of that was about refining down what it was that we thought we were going to try to do. And we
Mm-hmm.
ended up realizing that there was the reason that China's strategy was succeeding was because most people didn't know anything about it. And
Oh,
so if you're out there and you're bullying other countries and the populations of those countries are completely unaware of what's going on, or they don't
yeah.
feel it, or they don't understand it, then you're sort of getting to do it for free. You get to be the schoolyard bully, but you never get called to the principal's office.
Right.
And so you just do more bullying. And so we thought, well, they call that the gray zone because it's hard to figure out. It's hard to see clearly what's going on. So what if we turned on the lights? There's an old saying that when you turn on the lights, the cockroaches scatter. And so starting early this year, we turned on the lights, and we started to turn on the lights. I want to kind of, what we were doing starting in January of this year was using two different methods. One was tracking the AIS, or Automatic Information System, broadcasts of the ships at sea. And
Mm-hmm.
two was using overhead satellite images to try
Right.
to shine light on what we could see in
Mm-hmm.
the West Philippine Sea and actually in the larger South China Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And once we started doing that, we got a huge response
Mm-hmm.
because it turns out there were a lot of people who were really interested to know, and they felt like nobody had really been telling them. Well, it wasn't very long after we started doing that the Philippine government jumped in with both feet. And so now what we couldn't show you the video and the pictures that you saw over
Right.
the weekend. That had to be the Philippine government. And
Right.
great credit to the Philippine government, because this is new. This is
Right.
exciting. This is something that we haven't seen before in counter gray zone operations. And I
Mm-hmm.
really hope it's the start of something that grows beyond the Philippines.
Mhm.
Right. Right.
But
And
Ray,
I'll do a follow up, Manny, and then I'll call you.
mm,
You mentioned in an interview over at ANC I was watching a while ago that the world should learn from what the Philippines is doing in this crisis, and you just said this is something new. How crucial is this that the country, also the Philippines, under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has a new approach, different from that of Rodrigo Duterte when handling this crisis?
Well, right. So I think that President Duterte had a certain idea, and it was based on the idea that um, if you could give Beijing what it wanted, then Beijing would give you what you want, right? That Beijing
Mhm.
could be reasoned with,
Yeah.
cooperated with, and there could be a transactional relationship where, you give a little, you get a little. I think what became clear, even by the end of the Duterte administration, which was that the Philippines wasn't getting what was promised,
Right.
and that the aggressions in the West Philippine Sea were continuing. And so, I mean, so you saw the turn begin even at the end of the Duterte administration, and then for the latter half of last year, I think that the Marcos administration was still just feeling out how it wanted to approach this problem, because it's a hard problem.
Mhm.
It would have been surprising to see them come in on day one and institute a whole new program.
Mhm.
But beginning in this year, after it was really the laser pointing incident, I think that
Right.
made the biggest difference. And of course, I had put out some information which had resulted in some media, but frankly, my information was pretty sketchy. I mean, I was just there was a lot of speculation. I was open about the fact that I was speculating. I speculated that there was harassment based on the fact that the Chinese ship had gone dark, and I made some observations, and that resulted in some media. But the Philippine government then did something quite extraordinary, which
Mhm.
was it said, "Look, let's go ahead and release what we have." And what the
Right.
Philippine government had, of course, was pictures.
Mhm.
And that sort of, and what I think Manila, the Malacanang, I think what they learned was the Philippines got a lot of international support.
Right.
And I mean, they got the Americans. They got the Americans to come out and say, um, we affirm that the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty applies to Coast Guard vessels in the West Philippine Sea. And I know that there were people in the Philippines who wondered if that was true.
Mhm.
Uh, there were statements from across Asia. There were statements from the EU, and I think that Manila said, well, maybe we're not so alone here. And
Mhm.
what we have that China doesn't have is we have a network of partners and allies.
Right.
And so maybe if we figure out how to do this more, that gives us leverage. And
Mhm.
really, when you're talking about dealing with a large bullying aggressor, what you need is some leverage. If
Right.
the aggressor decides you're an easy target, they are going to keep bullying you.
Right.
And so the Philippines has gone about this year trying to make itself a harder target, in part by building some national resilience, and in part by building up its network of partners and allies.
Mhm. Money?
Yeah, Ray. Uh, you said a while ago that the Philippines has uh, done something new. Like the Philippine Coast Guard has some drones flying all over and taking videos and pictures of what's happening on the ground, on the sea. But there is a wider and a longer shot from the air. It could not be from the Philippines. So are we seeing an U.S. or other countries helping the Philippines monitor the situation on the ground?
Well, we've already seen, reports of U.S. aircraft overhead, and of course, the U.S. and the Philippines work extremely closely together. So I don't have any sort of inside information about
Mhm.
exactly which feed comes from where, but it would be surprising to me if the U.S. and the Philippines were not cooperating very closely
Mhm.
on
Mm.
collecting this information. And so I think that that's a healthy speculation, a healthy way to go about it. That is the benefit of having a treaty ally. And
Mhm.
Manny, I'm often asked whether the Philippines, what would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty, and I always sort of push back on the question because I'm not really sure what it means to trigger it. In some ways, the MDT is already triggered, right? You have active U.S. military involvement,
Mhm.
at least with overhead assets.
Mhm.
Uh, at this point, the question is really a question of degree. To what extent does the Philippines want, does the United States want, does together the two want to have more U.S. Involvement? Because, of course, U.S. involvement has a couple of different, implications, and so you have to
Mm.
think through all of what it is that you want to get out of that.
Mhm. What about joint patrols? The U.S. and the Philippine Navy or Philippine Coast Guard going on patrols in the disputed waters. Would it be helpful, or will it provoke China more?
Well, so I mean, when you talk about disputed waters, that there are degrees to that, right? So as soon as you go out over the 9 dash line, you're in disputed waters, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that China will react to every single time that you go into the
Mhm.
9 dash line. Um, if you were to say try to go in the vicinity of a particularly sensitive place like Ayungin Shoal, it will certainly provoke something from China. I don't know what. It's hard to predict. Now, the question of Coast Guard versus Navy, the difficulty when you talk about joint patrols with the Coast Guard is the U.S. Coast Guard actually does not have that many ships that it sends all the way to the Western Pacific,
Mhm.
for these kinds of visits. The primary job of the Coast Guard, like most Coast Guards, is to guard the coast, right? And the coast isn't here for the United States. It's all the way back where I am. It's not where you are. It's where I am. But it does, I know it does send some to visit other countries, and I'm sure that the Philippines gets its share of visits. The question is, how often is that? And I think that when it does happen, it's one of those things that should be talked about. So then the
Mhm.
question gets back to the navies, right? Because the U.S. does have a large navy. In fact, people have noticed that the USS Ronald Reagan is in the South China Sea right now.
Right.
And I think that there are always opportunities to do joint patrols, and I think that those should be taken up. And I think I applaud the Philippines for continuing to sort of bug the Aussies and the Japanese and say, hey, we want it. We don't just want it to be with the Americans. Why don't you join us too? Because it would be very helpful, I think, if China were to look at the Philippines and see it standing together with the Philippines' friends.
Mhm.
Mhm.
What Ray, I have been noticing that the freedom of navigation patrols done by the U.S. Navy, sometimes there are at least one Coast Guard vessel that joins them. So I think that is a new strategy from the U.S. of sending its Coast Guard vessels up to the South China Sea.
Yeah. Now, so a little bit of a technical point. When the U.S. Navy refers to freedom of navigation operations, they're talking about a very specific thing or very specific set of things. So those can take the form of passing within the 12 nautical miles of an island, but going in a straight line on innocent passage, and then not notifying the other country that it's doing that. It can mean it's going to go within 12 nautical miles of a low tide elevation, like an underwater feature that comes above the water at low tide, and do
Mhm.
maneuvers because it's
Mhm.
asserting the fact that that's not actually an island and it doesn't have a territorial sea.
Mhm.
Or it can go, let's say it goes up to the Paracel Islands, where China draws straight baselines around the whole thing and says nobody can come in here. And of course, we
Mhm.
go in there and we drive around,
Right.
because we are asserting that under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we are allowed to do that. So when we talk about freedom of navigation operations, those are the very specific things that we're talking about, and the U.S. Coast Guard does not do those things. So,
Mhm.
now if we do sort of presence patrols in the South China Sea within the 9 dash line, and we happen to interact with the Coast Guard, that's fine. But again, the Coast Guard's not here very often, so those things don't happen as often as you might think.
Mhm.
Mm.
Ray, I noticed that China is, I think, in this respect, they were surprised, like what you said, with the presence of the Philippine journalists joining in the resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal. And I noticed also in the Israel Hamas war right now, I think there is a war, an information warfare going on with both sides trying to get first crack on the narrative. Like I read this report from BBC where the Israeli Defense Force invited journalists and showed them the footage of what they got from the Hamas fighters as they carry out the massacre in the communities and in the music festival where they went to, and it shows the frustration of the Israeli forces of how the media was covering it, and it seems like they're playing into the narrative of the Hamas terror organization. Are you do you see the same thing happening here also with the aggression of China in the South China Sea, as it portrays itself as as their statements on Sunday said, they were more professional and they were the ones that were attacked, or some in some ways that it was the Philippine boat that bumped them. So how important is it that we really sift through the mountain of information that we get online, so that we would know what really is fact and what is disinformation?
Sure. Well, I will say the first thing is that China is learning from the Philippines, right? So now you're seeing, now when you take your pictures of the Chinese Coast Guard ship, you're taking pictures of a bunch of cameramen and video cameras, and they're trying to sort of tell their own story.
Mhm.
And we saw this even back on the 5th of August when you had the water cannon incident, that they
Yeah.
were having press releases and posting things on Twitter showing the times when the water cannon didn't hit the resupply boat, as if that's
Mhm.
proof that it never hit the resupply boat, which is ridiculous, of course. But of
Right.
course, in some ways, in the information space, everybody gets the information they want, right? So
Mhm.
if there's a person who is pre-inclined to believe China's version, they're going to believe China's version regardless of what you do, because frankly, they're not even listening to you. So in the end, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reach that middle group of people who is being presented with both sides. The advantage that the Philippines has, frankly, is that you're right, right? The Philippines has the moral high ground of being in the right. Beginning with having the being on the side of international law,
Mhm.
having the arbitral tribunal ruling in your back pocket already,
Mhm.
and being able to show, for example, that it doesn't matter if the Chinese video shows the water cannon not hitting the boat. Here's the video of the water cannon hitting the boat, and that other
Mhm.
video, frankly, then doesn't matter.
Mhm.
So I think that it is, but I do think, and this comes back to this assertive transparency tactic. It
Right.
is really, it's been impressive to watch it grow through the year, right? In February, what we got was 6 days after the event, we got a release of video and pictures of the laser. So it took a little while for the Philippines to put it out, and it was what was taken with iPhones, right? But
Right.
now you have embedded reporters, you have drones, you have you're actually going out and looking and finding the vessel swarms where they exist. You're finding the environmental damage when you cut the uh, uh,
Carrier.
the barrier at the mouth of Scarborough Shoal. There was
Mhm.
video of that.
Right.
These are important things. Because ultimately we all are strengthened or weakened by good or bad information, and in
Right.
a democracy, it's twice as important.
Right. Right. Mm.
Ray, do you find it ridiculous for China's narrative that the Philippine wooden boat would arrive with a still hulled Coast Guard ship of the Chinese Coast Guard?
Yeah, I mean, certainly anyone who just sees the video would realize that for them to do that would be like a death wish, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that came very close to being catastrophic for the UM2, right? It was that close. So I think that it's plain on its face, but what you saw was China showing certain camera angles that seemed to indicate that the resupply boat veered into the path of the China Coast Guard ship. And when people tell me that, first of all, I say, well, first of all, there's, that's why you have camera angles, right? You can sort of
Right.
manipulate them as you will. And there have been people who posted some pretty compelling pictures that show the Chinese ship turning into the path of the resupply boat. What I would also say is, it is plain, it is clear what the mission of the resupply boat is. It is going to resupply the Sierra Madre. It's not a secret. It happens once a month or every 45 days. Nobody should be surprised that it's going there.
Right.
And so if there is a large China Coast Guard ship in the way, what their first obligation is to try to get around that China Coast Guard ship. And if the China Coast Guard ship is going to try to prevent that, well, they're resourceful and they're going to try to get there. Now, in this case, it ended up in an accident, and thank goodness it didn't end up in a much worse one.
Right. Ray, considering the Russia-Ukraine war and Israel-Hamas war, I know the United States, as a global superpower, has much on its plate. So how is Washington reacting to the increasing tension in the South China Sea?
Right. Well, you see, I mean, they are obviously balancing a lot of different situations. But this, I think, all goes back to why this is important to the United States. So, if you go back to, say, the post-World War II era, and all of the things that happened in that, the formation of the United Nations, you had the formation of NATO, you had basically this building of what we all like to now refer to as the rules-based order. And the idea is that everybody who sort of played by a common agreed upon set of boundaries would be prosperous. And we enjoyed a long period of relative prosperity. It doesn't mean it was totally war-free, but it means that it was much more war-free than previous eras have been. There has not, thank goodness, been a world war since the 1940s, and we don't want to see another one, and we don't want to see generalized wars. But what we are seeing now is some pretty frightening things, right? We're seeing this breakdown of the peace in Europe and the Middle East, threats about Taiwan, and of course the South China Sea. And it is a worry that if there is kind of this general breakdown of the rules-based order, that's not replaced with anything good, right? And at worst, that can be replaced with something really, really bad. Right. So the U.S. interest is obviously in supporting its Philippine ally, but its larger interest is, we kind of like this rules-based order. And we kind of tend to believe that if everybody who kind of goes along with it, everybody does well. It doesn't have to be win-lose. It can actually be win-win. And it was for a long time. It's just that not everybody is satisfied with that.
Right.
Rick, what can the Philippines expect from the U.S., considering that, well, we have a statement from the State Department, we have a statement from the National Security Advisor, and we also have a statement from the U.S. Ambassador here in Manila. What can the U.S. do more in terms of helping the Philippines develop its capability to patrol the West Philippine Sea?
Yeah, I think that's probably occupying the time of a lot of people in Washington, D.C. and in Honolulu, where the Indo-Pacific Command is. And I actually, going back to gaining international support through the use of assertive transparency, is I think the Philippines is almost certainly doing itself a lot of favors, because, when you're at, we call it Indo-PACOM, when you're at Indo-Pacific Command, you have a list of all of the different ideas of how to help partners and allies all over the Indo-Pacific. We could help Vietnam with this. We could help Malaysia with that. We could help, the specific island with this. And all of those things involve resources, and there are only so many resources. And so now when people are looking at those really big lists and they see things that involve, maritime capacity for the Philippines, they're going to push those up the list, because they see visually in front of their noses on the news, they see what the Philippines is doing, see what China is doing to the Philippines, they're reminded that the Philippines, unlike those other countries, is a U.S. treaty ally.
Right.
And frankly, the U.S. has an obligation to back up its ally, right? So back to this whole idea of triggering in the alliance. Well, the alliance should already now be triggered as the U.S. is looking at how it spends its resources, looking at what it's trying to do for the Philippines in the space of maritime capacity, and doing more of that, and pushing those resources up that list of priority specifically for the Philippines.
Well, Ray, you are right, because the Philippines is not only a treaty ally, but it's also a major non-NATO ally,
Right.
designated in 2003 by President Bush. So
And
we should
I will
get
say,
more aid from the Americans.
and I will say this also, that even beyond all of that, what the Philippines is doing right now is worthy of support, right? So I'm saying this as an American. If we don't step up and support our ally who is out on a limb, right, taking assertive action to defend itself, showing the world what China is up to, yeah, it's up to us to reciprocate. That is a, I think, there are people in the U.S. and there are people in every country who tend to say, well, why should we support people all over there when we have our own problems? Well, in this case, the Philippines is doing something that is very valuable to the United States, and I think that deserves not just our respect but our material support.
Ray, I saw your interview at ANC, and you said there that China should pay a higher price internationally for what it is doing. And what exactly should the international community or even the United Nations should do?
Well, so what I've often said is that for China to carry out an active blockade against another country's outpost is the act of extreme aggression, right? Some people will get nervous because they'll say, wow, a blockade, that's an act of war.
Right.
Well, call it what you will. It is certainly an act of extreme aggression. And a country that does that to another country should face international outrage, should be treated in many ways as an international pariah state, right? This is beyond a little bit of bullying. You are actively carrying out an illegal blockade in another country's exclusive economic zone of another country's legitimate military outpost, and then we should be extremely clear on what that is. And those kinds of things should come before international bodies. It should be talked about. I would love to see, in the future, some of these statements of support use the word blockade, because that's the kind of language that's appropriate to what's going on. Now, the reason people get nervous about the use of the word blockade is they think that because blockade is often associated with an act of war, that means you're going to war. But that's not what it means, right? The decision to go to war is not a rhetorical one. It's one that nations make after extremely difficult deliberations and calculations and such. So, but it does mean that if another country is doing that to you, then diplomatically, economically, technologically, financially, there should be ways that they are paying for that, so that they are treated as a country that does things that are beyond the acceptable norms in the international space.
Ray, do you think that the Chinese are singling out the Philippines because we don't heard similar incidents in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Brunei?
So there are a couple of things about that. One is that the Philippines problem is kind of unique. Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brunei, they do not have Chinese military bases in their exclusive economic zone. That's the fact that Mischief Reef is in the Philippines exclusive economic zone is a shame in some ways, because it puts the Philippines in a uniquely difficult situation, right? There is not an equivalent in any of those other countries' exclusive economic zones. And that means that China is able to project power deep into the Philippine waters. And guess what's about 30 kilometers from Mischief Reef? Ayungin Shoal. So that means that's the second major thing that makes the Philippines unique, is that the Philippines is the only country that is facing an active blockade of one of its outposts, that it has to resupply. Vietnam doesn't have to do that. Malaysia doesn't have to do that. Indonesia doesn't have. It's only the Philippines. So the Philippines is in a tough spot. Now, I think that to some degree, the other countries are nervous, but also in some ways satisfied to let the Philippines sort of be out front, right? It's safer to be one step back than one step ahead. I think that that's short-sighted of them, because it won't always just be the Philippines. We all see where the 9-dash line, or the 10-dash line now, I guess, we all see where that goes. It doesn't just go through Philippine waters, and there will be other more serious confrontations with these other countries down the road. And if they don't speak up for the Philippines, then don't be surprised when nobody speaks up for you.
Right.
And are you not happy that ASEAN is very silent on this?
Well, let's maybe say I'm not surprised. Look, there was a former Singaporean diplomat who said, that ASEAN is not a horse, it's a cow. So don't expect it to run a race. Don't expect it to run in the Kentucky Derby. It does what it does. It's not going to necessarily do what you want it to do. So ASEAN is not well situated in the form that it's in to be able to sort of take a strong stand on behalf of the Philippines, or even on security matters generally. So, unfortunately, you're just going to have to hear it move.
I saw your interview at ANC, Ray, and I think you said it's ASEAN is just being ASEAN in this case.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't dislike ASEAN. I think ASEAN's a fine organization for what it does. This is just not something it can do. It is a consensus-based organization in which consensus is sort of loosely defined, but often means unanimity. And as you know, there are some countries in ASEAN who have very different priorities. And so, in some ways it's too big, it's too diverse, it's too spread out, it's got too, in order to do all the things. So it's very different from say NATO, right? People will often ask, if ASEAN could become like an Asian NATO. No, it can't, right?
Yeah.
NATO was formed with a very specific purpose, which unfortunately it has to sort of revive. In fact, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was some question about whether NATO was still necessary, and unfortunately, the answer has turned out to be yes.
Yeah.
But ASEAN, even though it started as CETO, as kind of the same sort of idea, never had that same clarity of purpose, and as it's grown, certainly does not.
Right, I want to go back to the security cooperation between the Philippines and the United States. What can we expect from the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or is ARIA still alive, the Asia Reassurance Initiative?
I have to confess, I don't keep as close track of that as maybe I should. I'm too busy chasing China ships around the West Philippine Sea to be able to keep up with ARIA. So I'm gonna stay in my lane a little bit and pass that on to somebody who knows about that more than I do.
Ray, speaking about your monitoring of Chinese ships, how many are you seeing now from the militia vessels? And the militia vessels are supposedly privately owned, or are they also controlled by the state?
Both. So they're privately owned but controlled by the state. And there are really, so the way that the whole thing works is that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army Navy, is able to give direction to both the Coast Guard and the professional maritime militia. And the maritime militia is built is broken down into two parts. There is, sort of the professional militia. These are the ships that you see in the videos that come back. These very, very large steel-hulled vessels that are sort of purpose-built to oppose and to assert China's will in places that are contested.
Mhm.
The other kind of maritime militia you see are a little bit are even fuzzier. They're fishing ships that may or may not fish. Oftentimes you'll see them just all tied up together, right? And you see that at Mischief Reef, but you also now see that at Iroquois Reef. You see it at Sabina Shoal. You see there'll just be this big group of ships, and they're smaller than maybe the ones that you see out, bumping boats with the Philippine Coast Guard, but they together, when you tie them all together, they make kind of a floating outpost. So, if you say, well, does China have an outpost at Iroquois Reef? Well, kind of. They haven't built one. There's no structure, but there are all these militia ships all tied up together. We call it rafting, because you tie all the logs into a raft. Well, they raft, and they're paid by the government to spend 280 days a year down in the Spratly Archipelago, and their job is to raft where they're told to raft. So they're not necessarily supposed to go out and oppose a resupply, but they do China's will simply by being there, and so they don't have to fish, and that's why because they're getting money for just being there, and that's why it's so hard to count them, right? Because how do you know which fishing ship is a fishing ship and which one's a militia ship and which one's kind of both, right? Because sometimes they fish and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they raft. And so when you ask how many there are, it's always really hard to come up with a number. I mean, you could say that almost certainly when you take them all, there's probably hundreds, maybe even more than hundreds, maybe thousands. But nobody has really. I mean, CSIS a couple of years ago tried to come up with a list, and the list has, of course, evolved quite a lot since that was 2 years, and we know a lot more now than we did then. They're just really hard to count because China continues to label them as fishing ships, and if you say, "Hey, isn't that maritime militia?" they'll say, "Who says it's maritime militia? They're shooting at anybody? No, it's sort of the game. They don't deny that they have a maritime militia, but they never quite admit that what anybody's doing is militia work."
So, Ray, you think that this rafting is some sort of occupying a certain space?
I think it's a form of it. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, that's what I think it's a way of China establishing its presence short of making a new structure, because China does know that at this time, once you actually start building a structure somewhere, that gets everybody really worked up. So if you just send down about 25 or 30 or 40 ships and a bunch of them raft up, and then now you've got a presence there. There's no structure, so they can say, we're just kind of hanging out. And then, of course, they believe they have a right to be there because they claim the water, even though if they're fishing, they're not supposed to do that because it's the Philippines EEZ, exclusive economic zone. So that, it gets back to what we call the gray zone, right? Because it's not the gray zone is this just area where everything's kind of opaque and deniable and kind of murky, and they can always just sort of, if you complain, if you say, "Hey, you're doing this," they can say, "How do you know we're doing that? We might be doing something else. Who says we're doing that?"
Yeah.
Well, do you agree with me that this is one way of skirting the 2002 Declaration of Conduct in the West Philippine Sea, the DOC?
Yeah, I one of many. Of course, the problem that everyone's always noted with the Declaration of Conduct is that it is too vague and it's not enforceable, right? So all you have to do is say, we're just doing the Declaration of Conduct. What we're doing is not violating it because it doesn't cover exactly this. And besides, who's going to do anything? I think that one of the reasons I don't believe that there will ever be a code of conduct is because the ASEAN nations, the maritime ones, need it to be strong clear, and enforceable. And that's the last thing that China wants. What China
Right.
wants is a weak, vague, unenforceable code of conduct
Mhm.
that after it's all signed can say, okay, great. Now we've all signed this weak, vague, unenforceable piece of paper. This is the new rule for the South China Sea, and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and that arbitral tribunal, that's the old rules. We got
Right.
rid of those because now we have this weak, vague, unenforceable code of conduct,
Right.
and those are the new rules. So
Right.
you can now stop crying about your arbitral tribunal case because we have new rules, and you guys signed the paper.
Right.
Mm.
Right. Right.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, that's I first heard that when I was in Vietnam, and I was told that by a Vietnamese official, and he said, that's why we got to be really careful with this, because if we sign the wrong thing, then
Right.
we could end up in a much worse situation than we're in now.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. And China could even use that if the matter reaches the United Nations, right?
Right. They say, yeah, sorry, I understand you guys have this old UN thing, but we, the regional countries, China and the ASEAN countries, we got together and we developed rules that work for us. So you
Right.
outsiders stay outside with your
Right.
outside stuff. That they will, and let us deal with what we've agreed to already with our new piece of paper.
Right.
Mhm.
Mm. And that is what China is pushing using its economic and trade deals with other Asian nations.
Well, if you think that, so China uses those deals, but they also use a tactic that we call elite capture. And
Mhm.
so when they make those deals, they try to make sure that all of the correct people get rewarded.
Right.
All the people that they need to make sure that everything kind of goes the way they want it to go. So
Mhm.
elite capture, it doesn't necessarily mean they're taking bribes. They could just be getting, projects done in their favorite places. They could, there could be carrots and sticks involved, but
Mhm.
it is focused in on particular leaders in particular sectors, whether they be government or outside of government. And if you focus enough attention on those people, you can really make things difficult to
Mhm.
resist you. So you don't really care in the end what the average Filipino thinks or the average Indonesian thinks or whatever, as long as you think you've got the president or the corporate executive or whoever in your pocket, you can still get what you want.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? Do you know what is a red line for the Americans? Because if China built a structure in Scarborough Shoal, would it not be a red line for the Americans because it's so close to Subic?
So the phrase "red line" is one of those that people get worried about, right?
Mhm.
Because you have to be ready to do something when somebody crosses the red line. So there was
Mhm.
an incident back in the Obama administration where use of chemical weapons in Syria was considered a red line, and then they were
Mhm.
used, and the United States was perceived not to have done very much about that. So,
Mhm.
but I do think that the if somebody were to see, so let me take you back a little bit. Back 10 years ago, I was in Vietnam when the island building campaign really got going.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, I was very uncomfortable because the Vietnamese were looking at us and saying, "Are you guys going to do something about this?" And of course, I was like, "Oh, yeah, sure. We got a great plan. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm sure there's a plan." And the truth was, we were just not ready for the moment. We just had not seen anything like that before. There
Mhm.
was, no solid consensus about what we should do about it. There was still the idea in the American system that China could be reasoned with and sort of brought back into the international order. And this wasn't this, it was a reversible departure, and we were wrong. The people, those ideas die hard, right? And
Right.
frankly, it wasn't until the beginning of the Trump administration where we had some old seasoned defense hands like James Mattis and such, who came
Mhm.
in and said, look, we need to sort of do a deep rethink about how we're looking at China, and frankly just be realistic. We have to sort of take off the rose-colored glasses and stop waiting for China to become what we think is a good idea, and start looking at what China is doing. Start basing our actions off of their actions. And so when our national security strategy and our national defense strategy came out, it was reflective of that change. And I was in Australia when that happened, and I brought in groups of defense experts from the Pentagon and from Indo-Pacific Command to explain how different this new strategy was, because basically it decided that we were going to treat China as a competitor that we could cooperate with where we could, but we would confront where we had to. So we have gone through, and I remember telling some of my Chinese counterparts there in Australia when it happened, I said, look, you shouldn't expect this is just going to change back if we get a new administration. This is deep. This is a deep, reassessment that's happening in the United States, and that's true, because you've seen the Biden administration has come in and basically kept up with those the same approach. And so the U.S., the difference between Scarborough Shoal in 2012 and then the island building campaign, where we were still trying to figure out what we were doing, and now is that we've had our awakening. Back 10 years ago, we couldn't say that, and many people have noted sort of the failure of deterrence at Scarborough Shoal, and maybe the weakness of the American response. We weren't ready. We just weren't ready. We were waiting. We were hoping that China was going to be something that it just wasn't going to be.
Right. Ray, how would you react to most of the comments of the pro-China apologists here in the Philippines that the Philippines is entering into a proxy war of the United States with China?
Yeah, I understand that view, and it does have a certain logic to it, right? There is a strategic competition between the U.S. and China,
right?
That is undeniable. But I think it's easy to just sort of wave away the Philippines' interests in all this, right? So, and by the way, the biggest purveyor of the idea that everything is a U.S.-China proxy war is China, right? That very much meets their narrative. Don't get caught up in the U.S. proxy war. But again, that robs the Philippines of agency, right? The Philippines has interests. The Philippines has issues, and as we've been talking about, what China wants to do with that narrative is it wants to discourage the Philippines from using the leverage that's available to the Philippines through its U.S. alliance. We've talked about the power imbalance. The only way really to address the power imbalance in the near term is its U.S. alliance and its growing list of partners. That's the way you change the dynamic and give the Philippines leverage. So if you say, well, and I think, I think the Duterte administration miscalculated when they thought, well, we can just sort of, if we push away from the United States and we move closer to China, China will like us more and they won't do these things. But what China saw was weakness. They said, okay, good. Now the Philippines has pushed away its treaty ally, and that puts them in a perfect position for us, because now all we have to do is exert our will, and the Philippines will have to do it.
Amani, can you give the final question to Ray?
Oh, well, Ray, what do you think is the next step of China? Because before shadowing, preventing, blocking, and now we have some kind of collision. What could be the worst we can expect from China?
Well, I think the thing that everybody's concerned about, and of course it came up in this particular event, is that one of these bumping incidents could turn into a really serious accident, right? There would, it doesn't take any imagination whatsoever to see the scenario where the impact on the resupply boat would go catastrophic. I mean, frankly, it could have just been a matter of inches, because, all it had to do is catch it at a slightly different angle, and all of a sudden that entire boat goes straight under the hull of that huge 100-meter Chinese metal hulled ship. There would have been casualties. That would have been bad. And I think we do have to worry that something like that could happen. People have asked me recently whether I thought that there was danger of, say, small arms or some kind of some kind of military or paramilitary action where guns are drawn. I think that China would like to avoid that, because I think that that's where you really make everybody at that point you can't avoid the question about the mutual defense treaty, right? You can't just sort of soft pedal it away and say, well, was this really an attack, or was it kind of a mistake, or all of those kinds of things. You can't, when somebody actually pulls out a gun and shoots you, that's different. That's personal. And so I think that China will probably try to avoid anything like that.
How about China pulling out Sierra Madre from Ayungin Shoal?
Forcibly pulling it out.
Yeah. So I don't think that they would try to do that under current circumstances, because I think that we have made it very clear that would invoke the defense treaty, the mutual defense treaty. Yes. That would be an assault on. First of all, the Sierra Madre has actual service members on it. So you'd have to figure out what to do about them. If you pull the Sierra Madre off, they go to the bottom of the ocean unless you rescue them. Or if you try to assault the Sierra Madre, all of those things, I think you can easily say that's an attack on it. And so the way a mutual defense treaty works is an attack on one is attack on both, right? So if you're attacking the Sierra Madre, you're attacking the Philippines, and then you're attacking the United States. So I think that they wouldn't do that. What do I worry that they would do, though? What I worry is that the Sierra Madre is on its last legs and begins to break up. At that point, China can come in and do a rescue operation, right? Yeah, and you rescue, you rescue, air quotes, you rescue the sailors on board, and then you say, now we'll take this hazard and pull it off so that it's not a hazard to navigation or whatever, exactly, environment, whatever. And now it'll go to the bottom of the sea where it belongs. And so that way they sort of have a narrative that says, we didn't attack anybody. It was a rescue operation. You should be thanking us. So that's the circumstance I worry about, is that the Sierra Madre clearly is coming to the end, and what happens then?
Right.
Yeah.
And that will be the time that we will closely monitor this. And personally, I would like to thank you, Ray, for what you're doing to increase the awareness of the Philippine public about what China is doing. To be honest with you, I did not realize how big what they're doing in the South China Sea, in our territorial waters, until I saw your tweets on Twitter, the satellite images and even the maps, the navigation reports. They're really helpful to give us a better picture of what's going on there. And it also helps me as a journalist to better understand the issue and to better communicate the events happening in that area.
Well, I thank you for that, and I just want to make sure that I say one more time how impressed I've been with the Marcos administration's assertive transparency campaign, and I really do hope that becomes something that is adopted more widely, so that China will have to they won't be able to just think they can intimidate the Philippines back into silence, but they'll have to worry about it now in other countries. So I think the Philippines should talk more about it and ask the other countries when they plan to start stepping up.
Right. And with that, we thank you, Ray, for joining us inside the press room. We hope to invite you in future episodes to discuss this issue and more. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you,
all right,
Ray.
Romel, Mandy, you guys take care. Ingat.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah,
Ray
thank
Powell,
you.
maritime security expert. And thank you, everyone, for joining us inside the press room. Until our next episode, take care and goodbye.